Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, this is Andy Strickler. I am currently the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College, located in New London, Connecticut. I've also worked in athletics and admissions at Kalamazoo College, Beloit College, Sinus College, and Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, will continue his conversation with me about how the financial pressures colleges are facing is impacting admissions decisions. Several of you sent in a QFL, a speak pipe question from a listener directed to Hillary, asking her to go into more depth about how Colorado College does not admit students who applied for financial aid, but then didn't submit the CSS profile. So Hillary is back to answer all of those questions our listeners sent in. We have a brand new interview I think you're going to enjoy. It's actually our first ever debate. I debate David Blobaum, the co-founder of Summit Test Prep and a frequent speaker on the value of test scores. We debate whether colleges should return to mandatory test scores, ACT and SAT. And you get a brand new second interview for our College Spotlight. I interviewed Jim Bach, the Vice President and Dean of Admissions at Swarthmore College. And we're talking about all things Swarthmore College in our College Spotlight over the next few weeks.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Friends, last week, Andy and I discussed how the financial challenges colleges are facing is impacting college admissions decisions. We continue with that discussion in the final part. And friends, the trilogy by Andy is now up on our website, and I encourage you to share it with your friends if they really want to go behind the scenes and understand how admission offices function. So here's another one. People might encounter more success on some of their appeals. Aid award appeals. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right.
Expand on that.
Well, looking at it from the dean's perspective.
Yep.
You know, if someone's in our regular decision pool, okay, I'm making some assumptions. They've probably applied to and have 10 to 12 to 13 apps out there.
Yep.
Which means they'll probably end up somewhere in the range of 7 to 8 to 10 to 11 or 12 offers of admission. Okay, those are some assumptions that I'm going to make. Do all students fit into that category? Absolutely not. But many students do.
Sure.
And if a student is willing to spend the time and the energy to come visit campus, or they're willing to express enough interest that says, hey, listen, I am interested enough in your offer of admission and offer of financial aid. I'm interested enough that I'm going to appeal it. In and of itself shows me that we're in play.
Yeah.
And sometimes
because they're probably not doing this to 10 to 12. So
exactly.
Now we're probably either the first choice school and they're trying to see if they can make it work, or maybe they're having a conversation with another one. So you're a little bit of a priority. You've already differentiated yourself from just the average RD admit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in some respects, the admission dean or the enrollment manager might say a small $2,000 or $3,000 investment on the front end can lead to 4 years of tuition revenue on the back end.
Sure.
So I think you're going to see more folks appeal. I think there's a little bit of a cottage industry out there to don't take the first offer, definitely appeal. And then I think you're going to see greater receptiveness from folks on the college side regarding this, in this, context of what we're dealing with in terms of this year's enrollment cycle.
Let me follow up on what you said about the cottage industry, because it feels to me, the 25 years I've been doing this, like that has changed.
You think?
That has changed. It is
Yeah.
more common now for families to appeal, maybe for schools to not always lead with their best offer, knowing that the appeal is going to occur, and leave a little more slush money in there, because it's almost, I hate to say this because this feels so disparaging, but more and more times it's people think of it as buying the car. Don't take the first offer. I'm sure there's room for some movement.
Correct.
Would you agree with all of that, or what do you think?
I would agree with every little bit of that.
When would you say it started to change? It's just been gradual throughout the last 25 years, or do you feel like, it really started changing about 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 5 years ago? It's been more than 5.
I think it's been in the last 5 to 8 years.
Yeah.
That's when I really think.
It feels closer to 8 than 5.
Yeah, I think so. But I would also say the pandemic probably
Sure.
kind of accelerated
Sure.
that. You're dealing with the parents of these graduates were young adults that lived through the 2008 recession and then back-ended that 12 years later with COVID. And therefore, they're carrying certain levels of economic anxiety with them, and they're trying to drive the best deal in some respects. And then there's also this cottage industry that we've talked about that feeds it, and in some respects is preying on that anxiety in a way that's going to generate a little coin for their pocket. No one does this, sort of financial aid counseling thing for free. I mean,
Sure.
Someone probably does, but they could make some money off it too.
Yeah. So let's talk about, we've already agreed, look for more aggressive use of ED because it's super valuable to lock people in for your net tuition revenue and just lots of reasons, right? Lower. I quote you all the time, Andy. The last time we were on, you were talking about how families tend to value lower acceptance rates. And a lot of what you said, we may not agree with it, but it generally doesn't serve you well telling people what they should believe. I thought you worded it so. Every time I say that to somebody, they're like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? So there's lots of reasons why we know ED, not to mention you have to spend less time working for a kid than if you're trying to fight 12 accepts in regular. Move on to other things if you can. Anyway, we know lots of reasons why that's appealing. So not everybody's going to apply ED. It's hard to get someone to apply ED.
Correct.
I mean, it's hard. I mean, we have a lot of decisions that we see in the company that I started. And there will be a lot of years that very, very reputable schools don't get a single ED out of us. And so it's hard. You got to convince, first of all, you got to commit somebody to just the whole concept, right? Committing without seeing the price. And then you got to ward off all the other competitors and get them to say, I want to marry you, not everybody else. So we know that that's tough. So there's another thing that you can do, which is have more sophisticated ways of using predictive modeling, because most people are not going to apply ED, but I still want to kind of know which ones are coming. It feels almost inevitable to me that colleges are going to try to beef up their sophisticated ways of predicting yield. I have a theory I'd like to bounce off you. I've really quite asked this before. And this is where I'm not on in the front lines like you are, but I think I have a pretty good understanding of how admissions work. So I think that some schools are using some pretty sophisticated ways that they keep really close to the vest of predicting who's going to come. I had an institution tell me when someone started having an engagement with us in the 9th grade, our yield for that kid is really, really high. Now, do you expect everybody to have engagement in 9th? No. But what if your research shows the longer they've been engaged, the yield is higher? What if your research shows if they're spending a lot of time looking at how you deposit and housing and all these indications that indicate they're probably going to come, because you can track your web traffic and you can see who's going to these portions that someone who's serious about you would tend to look at on the website. Why not have someone build a model out to you that includes some of those factors? That just kind of seems inevitable to me, that kind of stuff is going on. It's not stuff that you can't reveal the secret sauce, because one, then people will just game it more and it will decrease its efficacy. But don't you feel that stuff's going on? It feels to me like it has to be going on.
All right, ready?
Yeah.
We do it.
Yeah. This is why you're the best.
Yeah.
How many people would say that, Andy? Not very many. I talk to people like you all the time.
Not very many. We absolutely do it. When we get our applicant pool here, we screen it for what we call affinity every year.
Yeah.
Every student gets an affinity score with us, which is kind of a marker of how much engagement, 1 being the lowest score, 20 being the highest. Now, we don't use it until the very end of the process. So we're not reading apps with an affinity score staring us right there in the face. This year, we didn't even go through committee with affinity scores. When we got to shaping the class at the last minute, sure, we were looking at affinity scores.
Sure.
So yeah, we do it, and tons of places do this.
And many more do it than ever say they're doing it.
100%. Totally. 100%. You know, and the real question then becomes is, what are you doing with it?
Sure.
You know, and is it driving the actual decision, or is it just another influencer at what stage of the process? And for us, you know, we go through committee. We're a need-aware institution.
Yeah.
And for the most part, when we're finished with committee, we have too many really needy students in the class. So we have to sort of shape it a little bit to balance our financial aid a little bit. That's when affinity score comes in, because we're starting to say, like, which students have really shown the most affinity for us?
Sure.
And let's try to preserve these students in the class, because they've already gotten through reading and committee, and we love these students, and we think they're great, and we think they would make this a better place. So when it comes time to how we balance the class at the very end, then that's when we start using these affinity scores. And we're doing it all within context, you know, because, you know, affinity for a student from Groton, Connecticut, which, you know, if I walk to the athletic center, I can see Groton, Connecticut across the river.
Mm-hmm.
Affinity for a student from Groton is looked at very differently than a student who's first generation from Florida or Arkansas or Texas or Oklahoma. We can't hold them to the same sort of standard. But yeah, this is super prevalent across the industry. Tons of places are doing this, scoring affinity for kids, and have sophisticated amounts. And for us, they're like 55 to 60 different attributes for each student.
Yeah.
That goes into an affinity score. So it's really hard to game, because there's not too much emphasis or weight placed on one particular data point. There, you know, again, 55 to 60 data points per student that go into an affinity score.
And I predict you're going to see the rise of this in public schools at a level that we haven't seen before. I think it's already happening.
I guarantee it's happening.
Yeah. I mean, look at UConn. They went to ED, and I heard they brought in 30 to 33% of their class through ED in their first year.
Mm-hmm.
You think they're regretting that decision? You think others aren't watching?
I think Nathan is thrilled about that decision. He's loving life, except for the fact that they lost to Florida yesterday, and therefore will not win their third consecutive national title in men's basketball.
It was a really good game.
That's the only thing that has Nathan down today, I'm telling you.
Yeah. No. I mean, all of this stuff just makes so much sense. So when you talk about your 55 model affinity, how much of that was built out by you working with a firm that specializes in this, you know, this kind of thing, versus you just doing your own internal stuff?
We've worked with an outside firm that has specialty in terms of doing this.
Yeah.
We could have done it in-house, but I'd need basically a PhD in stats and econometrics on staff. And sometimes it's easier just to farm that out to a firm that has those folks on staff already.
Yeah. And
I have no places that have actually borrowed a math professor.
Yeah.
Who becomes on leave from their academic responsibilities and basically has an ad hoc 1-year appointment in the admissions office to do all of this modeling in-house. So there are multiple ways to do this. We just
And
didn't
are
want to
people happy
borrow
with
one.
that you've seen do that? Are they happy with the results?
Well, this is a results-oriented business. If you
Sure.
fail your class, you're thrilled with it.
Sure, of course.
And if you didn't fill your class, well, then you got to figure out what went wrong. So,
Sure.
The results dictate the satisfaction level.
And if you're fairly selective, it's not just fill the class, but it's fill the class with people that
Right.
the people that are watching you and observing you will deem as quality kids and meeting the institutional needs of the institution, not just you filled the class and hit a number.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I like to talk to people like you about this, and most people are using somebody outside. And some of the reasons they've told me is they have a perspective, not just of us, but all of the other schools that's really, really helpful when they can spot trends and things. And that's a perspective we're just not going to get if we do it internally.
Correct. 100%.
Andy, thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time.
No,
You told me your hard stop was 3. It's 2:58.
always fun talking to you,
Hey,
Mark. I
every
love this
3
stuff.
months, you're on my calendar to come back. Our listeners love it.
100% in, dude. Don't worry about it.
Thank you. Keep up the good work, and we appreciate you, my friend.
All right. Take care.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, in a segment Hillary did with me about 5 weeks ago, Hillary commented on if somebody applies for financial aid and they don't submit the CSS profile, how they follow up a number of times that if the student or parents don't submit the profile or follow up with Colorado College, then they're not going to be admitted to Colorado College. They are what we used to call, when I was in admissions, a DNCP, which is just an acronym for did not complete the process. Now, several listeners sent in SpeakPipe messages seeking greater clarity on this, and this is what I will be discussing with Hillary today. Okay, Hillary, thank you for coming back.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, and thank you. Anytime, listeners, you hear something that you would like to get greater clarity on that was said, we really appreciate that. And several of you wrote in to try to get greater clarity on something Hillary and I talked about in the past. I'm going to play sort of a few messages here all at once, and then Hillary will answer those questions.
Mark, this is Sandra from Massachusetts. I'm calling about today's episode, number 515, the question from the listener. The real reason I am calling in SpeakPipe with a question is Hillary then went on to talk about how at least Colorado College needs to receive a family's CSS profile to really know that a student is serious about the school. And that if a family doesn't send in the CSS profile, despite all the emails requesting them to, they'll think that this family really isn't all that serious about the school, and then they could reject, like a yield protection. So my question is, what about when there is no planet on which a particular family would be eligible for need aid? So they've done the FAFSA and their SAI is greater than $200,000. And there is just clearly no way that they will be eligible for need aid. So the family has decided not to do the CSS profile because, as you know, it's an extremely invasive form, and, why put your information out there if you aren't going to gain any benefit from it? So if will admissions see that SAI number and then, realize, oh, well, the family probably didn't bother doing the CSS profile because there is really, no way that they would be eligible for need aid. So, that's my question is, will admissions see a high SAI and give a pass to those families, or will they still possibly yield protect the applicant because they did not submit the CSS profile? Thanks.
And that question was from Sandra, and now we have another question from Louise.
Hi, Mark. My name is Louise. I'm a high school teacher, a parent, and an independent educational consultant, and your program is just fantastic. It's the first thing I listen to twice a week in my queue of podcasts that I listen to stay informed. So thank you and your team for all your great work. I have a question about something that was shared on the March 6th episode around Colorado College and the CSS profile. And here's my question. I've had many families that want to apply for financial aid and want to have access to the student loans, but know very well that between home equity and jobs and everything, that if they fill out the profile, they're not going to qualify for any aid. So they want the federal loans potentially to have that option, but they know no one's giving them any money. So I've had a lot of families, myself included, opt to not fill out the College Scholarship Service profile because it's a lot of personal information to put out into the internet. So I was really surprised when I heard that Colorado College would potentially not admit a student who hadn't filled out the profile because they weren't interested, when maybe it was a family who just knew they weren't going to qualify for any money and didn't choose to put that information out. So I would love to hear more about that, because if that's the case where families don't submit the profile and the kid might not get in because of that, that would just be important to know. So thank you so much for all your work, and I look forward to potentially hearing an answer to this. Hi, Mark. It's Louise Larson. A personal friend said to me, "Oh my gosh, Colorado College keeps sending me emails about my profile, but I know I don't qualify for aid. I know I probably can't afford it." Like they keep, and it was just funny because the very school that we were talking about, I have a friend getting emails from. So thought that was ironic.
Wow, did I feel dumb after you played those questions for me, Mark? Because I left out a really important sentence or clause, really. So let me try this again. When students have indicated that they are applying for financial aid at CC and they don't submit their CSS profile, that's very problematic, right? So these questions were like, but I'm not applying for aid. Why do I have to submit my profile? You do not, you should not bother with it. If you know that you're not going to qualify for aid and you're not seeking need-based financial aid, there's no reason for you to submit the CSS profile. But when students say, I need financial aid, and this is something that you indicate on your Common App or your Coalition app, and then they don't turn in their financial aid application, that is a problem. So I would say to the mom who was saying that she has a friend who said, I keep getting these emails, or my student keeps getting these emails from CC saying they need my financial aid application, meaning the CSS profile and the FAFSA. Well, that's because your student said that they were applying for financial aid. And so we need that information in order to put together the financial aid package, and we will not release admission decisions for students without a complete financial aid package, because we meet full demonstrated need, right? So that gap between how much your family can afford to pay and how much CC costs, we fill that in mostly with grants from CC. That's our institutional money. And we need to know how much is going out the door with our offers of admission in order to be able to complete our admission process. So that's called being need aware, which I know Mark has talked about before. And really it's just trying to make sure that we have our budget in line before we send out admission offers. So if you are a family who's I want my students to take out federal loans so they have some skin in the game, you should still fill out the FAFSA, but you don't need to apply for financial aid. Just fill out the FAFSA and get in touch with the financial aid office and say, hey, we don't need financial aid, but I do want my student to take out loans. So we filled out the FAFSA. What do I need to do next to make sure that process is completed? Because you don't want to be looked at as a student who's applying for financial aid if you're not. So that's why we need students to fill out the profile. Just if they're applying for aid, we can't put together their aid package without it.
So what would you recommend? Because there is a person, and it's not uncommon, that is filling out the application, and at the time they fill it out, they're people have a lot of times they have no idea if they're going to qualify. They haven't always done net price calculators before they complete an application. So they fill it out and then they check yes. And then later down the road, maybe they do a net price calculator, or they get some more counseling or more education. And then the one person said, they said, oh, I have a 200,000 SAI. And so now that I know I'm not going to qualify, why go through, right? Like they said, who wants to fill out all that personally invasive information to get nothing in return? So in that instance, how would you recommend that? Would you just recommend they go back and make sure they change the form?
Yeah, there are a couple ways that you can do it. You, at least at CC, and I'm sure this is different from school to school, you can just call the office if you want and say, hey, I indicated that I'm applying for financial aid, but I realized that I don't need to apply for financial aid. So I need to change that, and we can change it for you over the phone. You can go into your applicant portal and make the change in your applicant portal. There's also like you're going to get if you indicate that you're applying for financial aid and we don't get your complete application within maybe a week of the admission deadline, you're going to get a lot of emails from us asking you, are you still applying for aid? We haven't gotten your application. And in those emails will be a link in case you need to change from, we call it FAY, financial aid yes, to FAN, financial aid no. And you can go in and change there. You can also switch the other way. If you didn't think you would qualify for aid and then you did the net price calculator and realized that you do qualify for aid, you can switch it. It's better to do that sooner rather than later because of the amount of time that it takes to fill out the CSS profile and to upload all of your documents, right? You fill out the profile, but then you've got to upload your, like the parent's W-2, the parent's 1040. If the student worked, then their W-2 and their 1040. If you've got like some crazy financial situation where you have K1s or whatever, like we're going to ask for all of it. So the more time that you have, the better. And you can start that process ahead of time. You don't need to wait until the application deadline to do it. You should start it sooner if you can, because it's just easier to upload all that stuff at once. And the other thing that I would say as a parent who has gone through this a few times now, if you can keep all of your tax documents organized and electronic, like we have a Google Drive that my husband and I, or a Google folder in Google Drive that we share that's taxes, and it has each year. And every time another tax document comes in, we're just in the habit of putting it in that folder so that then, I mean, it makes it easier for my husband to do taxes, but it also makes it easier for me when I'm filling out my kids' financial aid forms and uploading those documents to their colleges. So much easier for me to have it all in one place rather than scattered all over the place. And like, there's a, you know, your W-2 is ripped in half because the dog ate it or whatever. Like just, if you can keep all that in one place, it'll make your process a lot faster.
Yeah, no, that's all really good stuff. You know, there's one other thing that I want to mention that I think our listeners would be interested in. So I've had a few conversations now with different schools, and I find people are always interested in stuff related to yield and related to predictive modeling and all of this stuff. So I've had a couple conversations, and I'll never forget one I had it in a college board conference in Orlando. And so it was a senior person, and they said, they were just talking with me, and they said, you want to know what student we have, like, you know, the lowest probability of yielding other than a total stealth applicant. So tell our listeners what a stealth applicant is so they know what I'm talking about, Hillary.
Yeah, a stealth applicant is an applicant who doesn't show up in your funnel until they submit their application. So you don't know that this kiddo exists until they've turned in their Common App. That's pretty unusual.
Yeah. So other than a stealth or ghost applicant, you'll hear people use those terms interchangeably. The person that applies for financial aid and we're not going to give it to them, like we don't yield them very often.
No, we call that an FAYNN at CC. So financial aid, yes, no need. And that's different from like an FAY or an FAN, right? An FAYNN. Yeah, it can be tough, especially if they're FAYNN, but what they can afford to spend every year is maybe $95,000, and all in, I'm looking at our current cost right now, all in at CC, it's like $92,000. I mean, nobody wants to spend $3,000 more than what the college says they can afford because they probably don't feel like they can afford that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have applied for aid. So those.
Yeah, I would go farther than probably they don't.
Yeah, they don't think that they can afford.
Well, you know what this is like. You know what this is like, though. You've been a parent. Like, you know, most people find that the SAI is higher than the number they would estimate themselves that they could pay for college.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
like, it's,
And I
yeah.
think that our calculation is more generous than the SAI because we have more information at our disposal. I have found the SAI to overestimate what people can afford more than our calculation actually does. But still, it feels unaffordable. And you don't know what else, like if the grandparents are kicking in $50,000 a year or something, like who really knows? Because that doesn't necessarily come up on, well, it should, but not everybody adds that into their CSS profile. So yeah, those students who've applied for aid, but we deem them to be no need are really, really hard to yield.
Yeah, so I just want people to be aware of that so that if you check the box expressing interest, and this particularly applies to schools that you're unlikely to get merit money for. This is very different if you're lucky to get merit money, because that's a whole different thing, right? Because because the aid award is not tethered to your ability to pay. But if you're doing that to schools that either do not give away any merit-based money, or they give it to such an infinitesimal amount of people that the chances of you getting it are pretty minuscule.
Or if it's a tiny amount, and so it's really not going to make a dent. Like we give away, our top merit aid package at CC is $10,000 a year. Well, if your cost to come here is $92,000, $10,000 is really not that helpful.
Right. U Chicago's like that too, other than like some one-off like police scholarships and donor things that, yeah. So if you're a place that either their largest amount is really small, or you give no merit money, or let's say it's a place like Duke that has merit money, but it's like 2 or 3 or 4%, and you got to walk on water to get it.
Yeah.
Just know that, the way one person worded it to me was, just know that schools that are very yield conscious can factor that into their thinking and say, I don't think the student's probably coming because they're expecting money. We're not going to give them money. They're probably going to go where they're going to get money.
Right.
And so I just think I just want people to kind of know, like, that's some of the thinking that happens behind the scenes that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you do have a grandparent who's going to be kicking in $50,000 and therefore the full cost of attendance is affordable for your family, then you may not want to apply for aid at a place that is need aware, because you're sort of handicapping yourself a little bit in that process. And if it's really not going to make a difference in your decision to come, then you don't want it to make a difference in the admission process.
Yeah, and there's being need aware, that's part of it, but it's also just the school's projections, like, will you come, right? Those are two different things.
Right.
Right? Like, this is somebody signaling that they feel they need money to come. We're not going to give them money. Somebody else will give them money because there's other schools there for whom they could get 20, 30, 40,000 in merit. We're probably not going to yield them.
Yeah. I mean, you're sort of getting hit twice, right? Because like it's a little bit higher bar academically if you're applying for aid, and then we see that you were applying for aid and you're not going to get any. That's like, it's a double whammy. And we admit students like that, but we do, when we're reading, think, oh gosh, what's this family going to think when they see this financial aid application? And we don't want families to have to stretch beyond their limits to afford to come here. That's why we meet full demonstrated need. We don't want people taking out private loans to afford to come here. So like a little bit of it is also thinking about the student and what's going to be best for the student, not only what's best for us and our budget.
Do you think, Hillary, this is getting slightly off topic, but not completely. So you know how you said a lot of times your packages are better than the SAIs?
Yeah.
Do you think that's partly because of the fact that you don't give merit money? Like, I've had conversations with schools over the years that don't give merit money. And sometimes there's a lot of factors that play a role in how that calculation is done, right? And some of them have said to me, well, we don't give merit money, but we're quite generous in other ways. And I'll see that. I'll see that with schools like Franklin and Marshall. I was having a conversation with Carleton I was like, how are you surviving out here when everybody's giving merit aid and you're not? And they said, well, you know what? We don't count home equity. We're one of the few schools that doesn't count home equity. So that's kind of how we try to, sort of speak to people and show some sensitivity. Of course, you have to have the resources to do that. I remember another school I talked to some years ago and said, do you know how much more money we would need to not count home equity? Like, we would need a tremendous amount more money to not do. I'd love to be able to not count home equity, but our endowment would have to be so much higher for us not to do that. These are complicated conversations.
They are really complicated.
Yeah.
I don't know that anyone here would frame it as because we don't offer much merit aid, we offer better need-based packages instead. I feel like those are hitting sort of two different populations, right? But we do, I would say it's more for the purpose of socioeconomic diversity. We try to offer generous packages so that we're not leaving out like what no one would actually call the middle class, but at CC
Sure.
we would consider that sort of middle income group between
Yeah.
$70,000 and $250,000. That's the group that can get squeezed the most
Sure.
in this process, and their SAI is the worst, right? And so I think we try to be realistic about what a family in that income bracket can actually afford, and to try to make it so that they can actually come to CC. And then part of it is also about our institutional priorities, where like for students who are from Colorado, we don't count any of their home equity because we really want to yield students from Colorado. Versus other parts of the country, we limit the home equity, but we include some of it in there. And so for students on the coasts where housing is really expensive, we limit it because we know that like $1 million house in California is not the same as $1 million house in Iowa. So I think there are some changes to those calculations just because we're realistic about how much of a family's income can actually go toward college. And yet it's still going to feel like a squeeze to some families. Like there are some families who are going to feel like, wow, I can't believe that I can afford this. I had a conversation like that 2 weeks ago with a family who was just in tears because they never thought that they would be able to afford to go to a college like CC, but they're a Colorado family and it is going to be cheaper for them to come here than it would for them to go to one of our regional public schools, which is huge, right? Like that's incredible. And then there are going to be families who are like, this is not what I envisioned paying, and there's no way that we can afford this. So every family is going to see it differently, but I would say it's more based on like what we realistically think that people can afford than it is on trying to make up for not offering much merit aid. We should also offer merit aid if we could afford to, but that would be more beneficial for families who are in the, much higher income brackets than it would be for families in sort of that middle range.
Yeah, and if anyone's wondering, oh, what do you mean? Do you tweak it for, families? Like, there's a lot of levers a school can pull, and Hillary mentioned one of the biggest ones is home equity, right? So what some schools do, well, only a couple handfuls of schools, short number don't count home equity. Like Hillary, they don't do it for Colorado. But some schools, they impose a multiplier, like a 1.2 multiplier.
Yeah.
And so that would mean like, if a family was making $100,000, we'd only count 120,000, 1.2 times 100, 120,000 of the home equity, which is going to be around $6,000, as opposed to, let's say someone is a teacher in California and they don't make a lot of money, but their house has seen significant increase in value. If you count all of home equity, which some schools do, then you can get these crazy situations where my salary is really low and you're asking me to pay this exorbitant amount of money.
Yeah.
So people can cap it on home equity. They can cap it on, a lot of things. Schools have policies. They can go in, especially with the CSS profile, and they can look at cost of living in your area. They call it higher cost area, and you can adjust for that. You can have policies on another kid in a K through 12 private school. Mm-hmm. And is that a discretionary decision that you made, or is that a legitimate educational investment? Some schools are doing that. Well, the profile's still doing it, right? For when you have a second sibling in college,
yep.
The FAFSA is not honoring that when they calculate your SAI.
Which is crazy because that is all coming from the same pot of money, right?
Right.
I don't know how they can justify getting rid of that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, that was, Tennessee senator really pushed it and felt like you shouldn't be punished because your kids are 4 years apart. But I understand the point. But you also have to pay it at the same time. We're getting off on a tangent. But anyway, there's quite a few levers that a school can use to control, especially a profile school. They have a lot of different tools at their disposal and discretion in terms of policies that schools can put in place. And so that's what I was referring to. But anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. I did a whole interview with Bucknell's financial aid director on 18 different reasons why 8 awards are all over the place. Hillary, this was great. I think you cleared it up. I think you
Good.
provided
I'm so
clear
sorry
guidance.
for just, I think sometimes Mark and I talk and I forget that there are a few thousand people listening who who don't have their heads in exactly the same space that we do. So I'm sure that there are times when I leave things out or say the wrong things and that there's confusion. So yeah, thank you, Mark, for prefacing this conversation by reminding people, like, if you're confused about something we said, please ask for clarification.
I've just done it so many times, I'm used to it. So this is just the first time it's happened to you. It happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the listeners that speak up, and
Yeah.
our listeners they're on it. So thanks, Hillary. I look forward to our next QFL.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Now you're going to get your choice of one of 4 books from the Princeton Review. So you got the best 390 colleges. That was 2025. And that's by Robert Frenick, David Soto, Stephen Koch, and Aaron Riccio. College Admissions 101, 3rd edition by Robert Frenick. Essays that kicked apps, 55 unforgettable college application essays that got students accepted by the Princeton Review staff. Or book number 4, Princeton Review Digital SAT Prep 2025. And Penguin Random House is the publisher of all of these books. Now, in order to get your book, you just need to email me directly at mark@schoolmatch4u.com. Put Princeton Review giveaway in the subject heading, and I'll know right away that you've sent in a question or we've read one of your comments. We read your comment on the air through SpeakPipe. You also get a book. Just put that in the subject line. If you remember the episode it ran on, put that in the subject header or in the body of your email to let me know which question you asked. And remember to let me know in the body of your email which question you asked. In the body of your email, also put your name and full address with zip code. I'll get your request submitted to Princeton Review within 24 hours. Once again, thanks to the Princeton Review for their generosity.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Good morning, friends. We're bringing you the first ever great debate on your College Bound Kid podcast. I'll be debating David Blobaum. And the debate is not contentious. It's not divisive. But I would say it gets spirited at times. And hopefully this format will be one where you can, process both arguments and come to your own conclusions. All we care about is you develop your own thinking, your own set of convictions. That's all that really matters. It'll be a 3-parter that goes about an hour and 20 minutes, so the segments are a little longer. And in part 1, David Blobaum gives his backstory. David says what his test score policy would be if he were working at a highly selective school. And here's a hint, I don't agree with him. I asked David if he thinks about using AP scores instead of SAT or ACT scores. David gives some proof that colleges are using test scores. David shares why he feels selective colleges need to use test scores in their admission decisions. I share some other factors that can be used besides test scores that, in my opinion, are better than using test scores. I share the primary reason why I am not in favor of test mandatory admissions. I share a creative idea that I would like to see colleges use that allows use of scores without them having inappropriately too much weight in admissions decisions. David Blobaum is the co-founder of Summit Test Prep. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with David Blobaum. Are you in New Jersey right now, David?
I am in New Jersey.
Awesome. It's great to have you here. David and I met about, a year and a half ago, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. We almost did an interview back then. Dave is the co-founder of Summit Prep. And we've just been having some great conversations over the last year and a half about standardized testing. And we're just going to talk to each other just like we would when no listeners were around. And we think it'll be good for our listeners. And we agree on some things on standardized testing, but there's some little nuance of differences. And, we never have wanted to brainwash our listeners. We've had a lot of very pro-test optional, content on the website and, various creative things that are out there right now. Recently, we've been very pro no harm test policy. Dave's got a little different perspective on some things, and I wanted you guys to hear it. So, Dave, why don't you start by giving us your backstory?
Awesome. So thank you so much, Mark, for having me on. It's really a pleasure and a privilege. My testing story goes back a ways. So I was, my dad was a hospice chaplain. My mom was a teacher's assistant for kids with special needs. And so, my dad wasn't like a Joel Osteen pastor. Money was tight, right?
Sure.
So the neighborhood I was in, it was a good neighborhood, but I, for whatever reason, was always very driven to pursue the best academic education that I possibly could. And so when I was in 7th grade, I asked my parents, hey, can I go to a private school? And can you look around at the surrounding private schools? They pulled the school profiles for all the surrounding private high schools. And I was actually looking at the averages of the school's SAT and ACT scores. So that's where I made my decision on where I wanted to go to private high school. So it was between Notre Dame in the Chicagoland area and Loyola Academy in the Chicagoland area. Notre Dame was all boys. So I was like, no, that's out. So Loyola was co-ed.
At least you brought in some holistic factors besides the testing.
Exactly. But, my parents said, hey, look, even though, I did the testing there, I got in, and they offered me a 50% need-based scholarship, but I still couldn't afford it. My parents said, still, we can't afford this. So, they said, hey, if you pitch in a fourth of the remaining amount, then we'll make up the difference. So I got a job as a caddy, and I made up a fourth of the remaining amount. I got my start in a really great high school through the generosity, mostly of strangers, through financial aid. And my story really just continued in the same vein of I then applied to the University of Chicago later, got into the University of Chicago, and ironically, it wasn't my first choice. A small Christian college called St. Olaf was my first choice, but they were going to cost 4 times as much money. So I was like, nope. Going to University of Chicago. So, and it was a great decision. But again, I was only able to go there really based on, well, probably, who knows the actual reasons, but I was probably able to go there because of my standardized test scores and, paired with the generosity of strangers. So then after University of Chicago, I actually got a job interview from the CIA and was hired to be a leadership analyst in Pakistan. But that's a 6 to 12 month long scope background check. In the intervening period, I started tutoring, loved it, did very well, and it actually would have been a 50% pay cut to go work for the CIA. So I stuck with tutoring. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, my path of I have been helped along in where I am today through test scores and through the generosity of strangers as well.
So how do you know that your test scores or what helped you get into Chicago when you weren't around the committee to hear the discussion of what attracted them to you? Maybe they wanted a pastor's kid.
Agreed. So I can't say that was the causal factor. So I would say that I had strong test scores for that college. We know that college is highly selective. And so, yes, I was not in that committee room. Maybe if I had had a much lower score, I would have been let in as well. But we can suspect that at the selectives and highly selective schools, test scores are very often a necessary but not sufficient admissions criteria. So usually you have to hit a requisite score, but the score is never going to be what gets you in, but it might get you into consideration.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, I often say, at schools where scores are mandatory, scores will knock you out, but they don't get you in.
Right.
And at schools where scores are optional that are highly selective. Well, I'll put it this way. It didn't surprise me in my recent interview with Christoph Gutentag when I asked him, when there's no test scores in the file, does that put more pressure on high AP scores? And I knew that the answer was yes, but I was glad that he said it. And I thought that he would, because he's one of the straight shooters out here, which is why I wanted him to come on. So yeah, I'd say at more highly selective schools, they do like to have some common benchmarks in the file. That doesn't mean, though, that they don't take kids outside of that because they're looking at things through a contextual prism. But we're getting way off where I wanted to go really quickly here. So what I want to do first is for you to lay out sort of your overarching view on testing. And then I will sort of share mine, and then we can have a conversation. And then it'll naturally lead us in these kinds of conversations like this. Because I was talking to someone about a year and a half ago that actually ended up hiring me, but started by saying, she started by saying, yeah, you don't like test scores, I know. And I said, well, wait a minute, because I don't feel like that's actually my position. My position is very nuanced. So I look forward to clarifying my position, but I think it'll be helpful for listeners to hear your position. I just think it'll make for, the whole purpose of this is just similar to that learning style where you hear a debate, right? Socratic method, and let people hear different approaches and let them process and come to their own view. So hopefully it'll be good for our listeners. So why don't you go ahead and sort of share your overarching view on testing, both what you believe and both your understanding of how colleges use testing.
Absolutely. So to your point, there is going to be nuance there that I'll gloss over in the general overview. But generally speaking, I think that test scores are very helpful at the very selective schools and diminish in their helpfulness as you go down to less selective institutions. And I would put some numbers on that. So the latest data that came out last year, it was that data and research by Chetting, Friedman, and Deming was the basis for the New York Times article, The Misguided War on the SAT. What they found is that SAT and ACT scores were 3.9 times more predictive than was high school GPA at predicting first-year GPA at the Ivy and Ivy Plus colleges. Now, what we can get into the nuance there is because basically everybody has the same grades who's applying there, right? So there's not going to be very much variation in grades. So then that little variation in test score would naturally be more predictive. But then when you go to the much less selective colleges, so the most recent high quality research done was in 2020 by the University of Chicago. They were using data from 2006 to 2009. So there was less grade inflation there. That's why I mentioned the date range. They found that SAT and ACT scores barely improve the prediction of a student's first year GPA in college. But the average ACT score in that study was a 20. So because at those less selective institutions where students are getting in and going who have a 20 on the ACT, which by the way is average, it's not bad. Sure. There's just a lot more variation that admissions officers can see in GPA to make their decisions. So test scores are not as predictive. But so that's how I see it as maybe what the role should be. And then we can get into the nuances of what the role is in merit aid that is very often automatic, or AP exam scores, or the test blind schools that actually look at AP exam scores. So there's tons of nuance beyond that.
Yeah. So then if you were an admission director at a highly selective school and you had a vote, let me just put it this way. I won't pin you in that, precisely. But if you could write the policy for what your testing policy would be, what would you say? We have lots of things out there, right? You've got the, you follow this stuff. You've got schools like Brown and Dartmouth, and there have been some in the 1% group and 2% of the most selective schools returning to an ACT or SAT as a mandatory, right? And then we've got schools like Yale that are letting you select either all your APs or SATs, so gone to more of like a test flexible model. We've got schools out there that say test recommended. We've got schools out there that are using this no harm policy. We won't use it against you, but only use it for you. We've got schools that are test optional for ACT, SAT, but very clear about the fact that APs or IBs will be factored in. There's this but official policies out there, but I certainly know of people, and even our first conversation we had where you had a different view on maybe if you're coming from an under-resourced versus a well-resourced school or well-resourced family, you saw that as a differentiator and what a policy should be. So what would be your policy if you had the sole voice and David, whatever you say goes, and you're at a highly selective school like a U Chicago or whatever?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever thought about what I would actually do. So, what I would do, I think, is for those highly selectives, I would go back to test required because I like transparency. And in my opinion, there isn't honesty or transparency when you're a highly selective institution and you're test optional. And I'll put some actual, evidence behind that. So Jeremiah Quinlan, when Yale went back to test required, he said that, quite frankly, they didn't feel like they were being honest before because they had a triple higher admit rate for students who submitted test scores. Cornell was very explicit that they do not disadvantage you if you don't, like most schools, that they don't disadvantage you if you don't submit test scores. But then when they went back to test required, they noted that they weren't abiding by their own language that they had said. And so I would do that to eliminate ambiguity, to make sure that, everyone's at least on the same playing field as far as submitting test scores to colleges that we know value test scores. However, I would very much look at test scores in context. So I had a good ACT score. I didn't have a perfect ACT score. So to the point of, I think my ACT score helped me get into the University of Chicago. But if I was judged solely based on my ACT score, I don't think I would have gotten into the University of Chicago. And I guess actually, just to give more context, when I interviewed at the University of Chicago, and this would support your point that it certainly wasn't just based on the test score. He told me at the end of the interview that I was going to get in. So clearly I had a good interview and he liked my background. He liked the fact that I was working when I was 13 years old to help pay my way through, private high school. So the test score was only one factor. And that's how I think test scores should be one piece of the puzzle, especially when it comes to helping. I don't like the term diamonds in the rough because it's gotten so in many ways politicized, but that's how I feel like they should actually be used. The thing that I would strip out is a lot of the things that people use for loopholes. So legacy, I would prefer if we got rid of, or, these preferences for large donors. I would like a simplified process that favored wealth less.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, it's been a while since I've given you a recommended resource, and this one I am excited about. It's the college's admission website. In my interview with Jim Bach, he talked about this. It is one of the absolute best places to go to learn information about the school, especially the admission section. So specifically, and you'll find this also in our show notes, if you go to swarthmore.edu, swarthmore.edu, and then you click their admissions and aid tab, which is right at the top, it's one of the top headers, you will see it's under the how to apply section, a link that says apply to Swarthmore. And then to apply to Swarthmore, it says what we look for in a SWATee. Now, this is what Jim talked about. These are the personal qualities and attributes they specifically look for in their application. In fact, I'm going to read what it says from the website. While no individual student can epitomize all of Swarthmore's values, these are the qualities and attributes that we elevate in our application review process. Okay? And then it goes through and it lists 8 of them. And there's also a section on how we evaluate your application. Now, not every college has this, but SWAT is not the only one that does. And I just encourage you to check it out. We'll put the link in the show notes. So let me ask you about a couple conversations I've had with different people of different policies. And what are your thoughts? So I got to spend time with the 3 highest leaders in UCLA's admission office in September. They think their, test-free policy is working amazingly well. They feel like they're able to attract the right kids that they want, and they have no plans on changing it at all, and their faculty's happy and everybody's happy. You probably know the UCs for a while were looking at coming up with their own test, and partly because it was going to be very difficult to do it, but also because of the feedback has been really positive. They are happy to stay with their current position that they have. So I'm going to ask you sort of 2 schools at once. I probably shouldn't do it this way, but recently I had an opportunity to talk with the people at Case Western Reserve. So they have a test optional policy, and their faculty voted 39-2 to keep it. Now, the way Rick Beschloff and some of the other leaders there explain it is we are test optional, we are not evidence optional. And we can look at grades, we can look at rigor, and we can look at AP score performance. And if we see a 5, we don't need an SAT or an ACT. We just don't. We can make really good admissions decisions without them. So just what are your thoughts on what I've said so far?
I completely agree, but I have a bone to pick with these test-free, test-blind colleges calling themselves test-free and test-blind when really they're SAT, ACT-free, SAT, ACT blind. So I completely agree. You don't need an SAT or ACT score if you have AP exam scores, for instance, or generally you don't. And so UCLA, they use AP exam scores. So does UC Berkeley. So does UC San Diego. Which, I don't know how they wouldn't, though, because 2023 is the last data that we have, I believe, for UCLA. 59% of admitted students to UCLA had a 4.0 out of 4.0 unweighted GPA. So 59% had the exact same perfect GPA. How do you differentiate between students who all have the same grades? I think then you need some other differentiating factor, especially in an era of rampant grade inflation where the average student going on to a 4-year BA granting university has an A average. So I think that's why UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, they use AP exam scores. Just like you said with Case Western, I would say don't call yourself test free, call yourself SAT, ACT free, but be honest that you value standardized exams because they give you a common metric.
So I want to say something because the Case Western folks actually I see as different than UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
UCLA, I talked to the 3 highest leaders in their office, Gary Clark, Fiona Reese, and I wish I could remember the third one right now, her name. They have very different views on AP even than Case Western. So one of them basically said they don't find them helpful. Another one said that when we see really high scores, that can factor into the academic review. It can be part of the academic review. And then another one basically said, we want to see how many 3s, 4s, or 5s you have. We're going to differentiate 3, 4s, and 5s versus 1s and 2s. So I want to go back to how could you make decisions when 59% of people have a 4.0? There are a lot of things that you could do. For one, we haven't talked about the rigor of your curriculum. A 4.0 when somebody gets to Algebra 2 versus a 4.0 when somebody gets to, linear algebra, multivariable calculus, or even BC Calc. That's very different performance. So there's the rigor of your curriculum, right? There's also every single thing your teachers say about what kind of student you are. And then there's the concept of distance traveled, which is very important, which is looking at you through the prism of your opportunities and also looking at your personal qualities. My biggest problem, so we do have a disagreement. I would absolutely not have a test mandatory policy. And the reasons why I wouldn't do it would be, one, I think that if you really do admissions well, you don't need an ACT and SAT to be able to figure out if somebody can do the work and how well they can do the program. Secondly, this is my main problem. I'll put it this way. I am not of the position that test scores bring no value. I would never say that. But what I would say is that most people cannot put the scores in context to give them the value that they deserve. They end up overshadowing personal qualities, which are so highly correlated to not only whether you'll have a good student, but whether you have a good citizen or you'll have someone that'll kick butt out there as an alumni in society. And numbers do voodoo on the brain. That's the same thing with rankings. Rankings mess with the brain. Numbers do voodoo on the brain. And most of this is, I'm partly drawn off my own experience. I felt for the first 4 years I did admissions, I was totally looking at test scores. And it took me a long time. It actually was a study that I started looking at the students that were struggling the most on our academic concern list. And a lot of them were really high testers. Now they struggled with other things, maybe organization, motivation, learning differences or something. And certainly there is a correlation between high testing and good performance, and we know that. But I think there's enough other tools in the toolkit, and I feel like test mandatory policies end up putting too much emphasis on testing, and they end up overpowering personal qualities and character traits that I think not only make great citizens at a college, but they make great alumni and great productive people. And they end, because you see a number and in effect becomes a cutoff. Now, I think there's room for more creativity in this space. I certainly think that schools need to do validation studies and sort of look at, okay, what is the numbers for which students struggle? Like, that's a question that I used to love to ask admissions people. I'd say, what's the number that for all intents and purposes is a cutoff, and what's the number where you get concerned? And everybody's kind of got something like that. I prefer if it's based on research, not just on somebody grabbing a number out of the sky. So, I would love to see something maybe like schools establish that baseline and somebody's got to take a test. And if they hit it, they hit it. If they don't, they don't. And they have to check the box. Yes, I hit that score. But then nobody ever sees it. So you hit the baseline number of what the school's research shows is successful. And I fully expect that at a place like MIT, that can be extremely high math because it's MIT and the amount of math you have to take. But that is some incorporation of testing. I'd be okay with that. It's evidence-based based on your research, because what that would do, in my opinion, is it would keep scores from unduly influencing the brain and putting more weight on the evaluation than I feel like it should. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that makes a lot of sense to have a cutoff. So, I think we are talking about test mandatory. It would be test mandatory that really, it is true, though, at the highly selective institutions and the selectives, they're trying to answer, can you do the work? That's the first question that they have to answer.
Correct.
But then the test scores and even the GPA don't matter after that, right? Then it's, are you a good fit for our institution? Will you be a good community member? Will you be a good citizen? So it is all those other things. So to your point, I don't want the test score to have undue weight. I think it's a very important piece of information. I think the data bear that out, that students are more successful. They have higher graduation rates if you have a higher test score. So I think there's an appropriate piece of the puzzle there. But I think we would both agree it should not be, outweighing other things.
And what are your thoughts on? I know you've seen the research that test scores are highly correlated with the income and education level of the parents.
So the tricky thing is that it's hard to get away from anything that is correlated to income, right? So higher grades are correlated to income, right? Like if you go to a private school, they have more grade inflation there. If you look at access to AP exams, that's correlated to income. If you look at the quality of teacher recommendations, that's very highly correlated to income, because those public school teachers, a lot of times they're just, no offense to them, they're doing a great job. They have a ton of students. A lot of times they're using a form template for recommendations. It's been demonstrated through research that you have longer teacher recommendations of higher quality. So my issue with teacher recommendations, while they're very helpful, is a lot of times the value of them comes from the quality of the writing of the recommender rather than the person who's being recommended. So that would be my concern there. And essays too. I mean, the quality of the essay is very highly correlated to income, even more than SAT and ACT scores. And then you get into everything else, which is legacy, which is athletic recruitment. Those are even more highly correlated. So I think there's no perfect measure. That's why I do agree with the holistic approach. But if we strip away everything else, right? If we control for every other factor, I think the question is do SAT and ACT scores help predict success in college? When you control for family income, everything else. Yes, they absolutely do. Again, 3.9 times more predictive than our grades when controlling for every other factor. But then the question would be, well, why do they do that? So they're not testing you on random things on the SAT and ACT. They're testing you on what they have tried to determine is the most predictive, the most necessary content and knowledge. So the basics of reading, the basics of mathematics, the basics of rhetoric, grammar. So I see it as the tests are not perfect, but they're quite good measures of your knowledge and skill on fundamental knowledge, on fundamental topics. So that's why they are actually predictive. Now, the wealthier kids have more access to getting that knowledge and skill, but that doesn't mean that the tests themselves aren't accurately measuring that.
I mean, I definitely agree with your point that every single aspect of this part of the process that counts, having resources is going to strengthen your application, starting with getting into very good suburban schools or private schools right away. So I do agree with that. And I think it's fair. I think it's fair to bring that up. Read those recommendations, essays, athletic recruiting, legacy, all of that. Friends, this concludes this part of my debate with David Blobaum. We hope you come back for part 2 of 3.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, I'm really elated about this interview. It's with Jim Bach, who's the Vice President and Dean of Admissions at Swarthmore College. And Jim and I have been going back and forth about this interview for well over 2 years, close to 3 years. So I always get excited when we finally get a date down on the calendar. We do a real deep dive, a 70-minute deep dive on Swarthmore College. So in part 1, Jim tells us his story from leaving Austin, Texas, and heading to Swarthmore first as a student. And Jim shares how he answers the question, I've never heard of Swarthmore. What can you tell me about Swarthmore? Jim explains how Swarthmore's founding is different from Haverford College, another Quaker school they're often compared to. Jim shares the intellectual qualities that when he's reading a file makes him think this could be a good match for Swarthmore. Jim also shares the personal qualities that SWAT values, that when he's reading a file he thinks this student has these personal qualities. They may be a match for Swarthmore. Jim explains how committee-based evaluation, also known as CBE, works at Swarthmore College, and how they use CBE to evaluate an admission applicant. Jim explains the difference between reading a file with CBE versus the traditional way they read files before they implemented CBE. Jim shares why he finds reading by school group helps the admission file reading process. Listen and enjoy. Friends, you're in for a treat today. I'm here with Jim Bach from Swarthmore College. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm thrilled to have you. I left Westtown School 16 years ago, and you were a kind of a household name in the world of college admissions back then. And it's nice to see, 35 years at the same institution that you graduated from.
Yeah, well, I graduated in 1990, took a 5-year hiatus in the real world, and then I returned in 95, 96. So just finishing year 29. But it feels like 35 sometimes.
Awesome.
It feels like 5.
Awesome. So we're going to do 2 things, friends, over the next hour. We're going to have Jim help us to understand Swarthmore College better. I mean, I don't know of a better person to do that. And it's a school that many of you have reached out and asked us if we could have a deeper dive into, and then we're just going to talk about some general things in the world of higher admissions. But Jim, why don't you start by letting people know your background, your backstory?
No, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on, Mark. We've talked about this for a while, and I'm glad to be here today.
We have.
So I'm originally
Before you start, I do have to say several people have said I have to say hi to you.
Okay.
So, 3 of our co-hosts, Julia Esquivel used to be over at Haverford College, Julia. Then we also have Vince Garcia, in Los Angeles. And Vince said, I want to do the interview with Jim. It just didn't quite work out. And then, of course, you and Susan Tree have probably known each other for 30 plus years. So 3 of our co-hosts say hi to you.
I appreciate that. And hello back to all of them. It's been a while that I've seen them. Actually, I saw Susan with you at NACAC. It was great to see her. And we go back to my first job. So in terms of my background, I'm originally from Austin, Texas. So a Texan native, born and raised, public high school grad, was actually raised by a single parent. My dad passed away when I was young, and so she raised me and knew I was going to go to college. She finished college. So I wasn't first gen, but I was low income and really wanted to go to school outside of the state and didn't really know what that would mean. Could we afford it? Where would I look? And I was extremely fortunate. I had a best friend whose father is an attorney, and he offered to take us on a college trip. So you know about the college trip. Well, that was something we couldn't afford, particularly leaving Texas. But he said, I'm going to take you on it. I'm going to take my son on it. And we looked at a bunch of schools. We looked at a state school that wasn't UT Austin. We looked at an Ivy League. And I think he said, I don't care which Ivy League you don't get into, but it's got to be near New York so we can see some shows. So we looked at Princeton and maybe Columbia. We looked at Georgetown, and his law partner said, hey, there's no liberal arts college on there. You need to look at Swarthmore. So we looked at Swarthmore. Fast forward a little bit, I ended up applying to Swarthmore, and it ended up being the only school I could afford to attend. It actually had the highest sticker price of all the colleges I applied to, but the lowest net price. So it was actually less expensive for me as the child of a single parent to actually travel 1,600 miles away to Swarthmore, and it made all the difference. So really glad I landed at Swarthmore, and I came in political science economics, knowing I was going to do policy work in Washington, D.C. And as you know, liberal arts colleges can change your trajectory. I ended up majoring in religion, and now I'm vice president and dean of admissions. So there is no degree for what I do. My roommate, on the other hand, is a doctor. And so, of course, he majored in history at Swarthmore, because any good doctor is going to have a well-rounded education, including biology, psychology, physics, chem, and all those great things. But of course, you could major in anything and go to med school, to go to law school, to business school. So we basically pursued what we wanted as undergrads and then pursued our careers after. So he knew what he wanted coming in, and I was pretty clueless. So once I graduated with that degree in religion, I said, well, I've got some loans to pay off, and how can I do that? And I said, you know what? This is a pretty special place here. We're not the only one. And I actually realized I could get paid to actually talk about college admissions, share my story with families, and promote the liberal arts and the residential liberal arts, and ended up at Connecticut College. And that's where I actually met Susan Tree, who worked at Bates at the time. So we go way back. And I worked there for 3 years, ended up at UVA for about a year or two, getting a master's degree in education, running a restaurant, and kept trying to get out. I actually thought I would end up on the counseling side, but a job opened up in 1995, 96 at Swarthmore. And I said, you know what? This is a wonderful place. I believe in the mission. And I came back as assistant dean and have stayed 29 years and sort of worked my way up the ladder. And as I think back on it, I just am very fortunate to be at a place that supports its mission, that is sound financially, and it's not just a local, but a national and an international school that is not as well known as other big name schools. But that's why I enjoy coming to work every day, to sort of share the good word about residential liberal arts colleges, Swarthmore specifically, but I'm always promoting all colleges, but particularly small colleges. And so that's a quick, brief history of me.
No, that was absolutely fantastic. And there's a number of things I want to kind of come back to that you said on that. But, I'll tell you an interesting story. Our listeners are really sharp. So, we have these college spotlights and we do these deep dives. And we had, Lydia, former member of your admission team back in the day. We had her on to talk about law school admissions. And because, she's gone on to work in Kansas City law school admissions after leaving Swarthmore. So in her introduction, she, just like that, she talked about how she worked at Haverford and Swarthmore. So I had to ask the follow-up question, how are Haverford and Swarthmore different? So that was just kind of meant to be a little aside question. And then we ended up turning it into a segment. I remember seeing you in Los Angeles. You talked about, hey, it popped up in your message box. Well, one of our listeners said, you didn't really do the deep dive on Swarthmore we're used to. Go back and look at your Northeastern spotlight and compare that to the Swarthmore one. And I'm like, I hear you. Well, we'll fix that. We'll have Jim Bach on. How's that? So, that's a little backstory how we got here today. So, Jim, let's say you're in an Uber and you get talking to the Uber driver, asks you what you do. You say your role in Swarthmore, and he says, I've never heard of Swarthmore. What can you tell me about Swarthmore? Take some time to unpack that. How would you answer that?
No, I appreciate the question. And I will say that question has actually come up, not more than once. But also, I will let you know, I'm often surprised at how often the taxi drivers or Uber drivers actually know about Swarthmore or have a friend or a cousin or are from another country and have heard about it. But many have not heard about it. And so what I say is, listen, we are a residential liberal arts college outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I ground it in terms of location. Where are we located? So we're 12 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the sixth largest city in the country. We were founded by the Hicksite, or farming Quakers. They're the progressive Quakers. Haverford, so you mentioned that, was founded by the Orthodox Quakers as all male. And Swarthmore was founded co-ed from day one. And so that was a little bit different in the 1860s. So we weren't the first education for women, but we were one of the first co-educational institutions. Many women could not go to college, but if they did, they went to single-sex institutions, many of which still exist today. But founded these progressive Quakers, the Hicksites, wanted to educate both their sons and their daughters with a liberal arts grounding in terms of education. But then they also did something a little unusual in the 1880s. They added engineering. So we've been offering a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering alongside of our other Bachelor of Arts degrees. And so at the time, they were studying the steam engine. Today, it may be just the hydrogen fuel cell motorcycle. So in terms of location, we love being near Philadelphia, just about half an hour's drive. And we also have a train on campus. And so we're actually 25 minutes from the University of Pennsylvania, 26 minutes from Amtrak, and 28 minutes from Center City, Philadelphia. And in terms of our liberal arts approach, students have to take courses in the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And so having that access to the city, but being a small campus of only 1,700 students comprised of students from 45 to 50 states and probably 50, 60, 70 countries in terms of international citizenship or dual residency. So you have access to students from all over the world with access to amazing faculty whose primary focus, or essentially sole focus, is undergraduate teaching in addition to research and service. So just culturally, I would say Quaker founded, but not Quaker today, co-ed from day one, commitment to the liberal arts outside the sixth largest city in the country. So again, that's sort of my 3-minute elevator pitch in terms of a little bit of culture, a little bit of history, and location in terms of where we are and what we do.
That was good. I love it. Let's talk about the intellectual qualities that you look for when you're reading a file. What's it that makes you think this could be a good match for Swarthmore from an intellectual quality standpoint?
No, it's a great question. And I think, there is sort of I don't know if it's a misconception or listen, my student has really good grades, really good scores. Obviously, they were competitive, right? And so I often do this exercise when I'm working with students is I'll put up 3 short essay answers to old Common App questions. And it's just an exercise to where they read these essays. And I give them a title. And one of them I titled The Tyranny of the Great and the Best. And this student uses the words great and best 9 times in like a 3-paragraph essay. And it's like, I'm top of my class. I'm the greatest. I want to go to the best college, get the best education to get the greatest job. And I'm like, so is this a good essay? And they start chuckling. I said, you're laughing. And they're like, well, they don't say anything. And I said, but what are the grades and scores? And they're like, oh, he must have bad grades and bad scores. I said, actually, this is a valedictorian with a 1,500. Did we admit them? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, but that's not fair. And they're like, but the essay. So then I show them another essay where a woman talks about her inability to dance, and she loves to dance, and she dances awkwardly, and she loves the freedom to make mistakes. And I said, so tell me about this student. She's like, well, she's an artist. She wants to major in music. And I said, actually, she's an engineering and a history minor, engineering major with a history minor. And what she talks about is what she doesn't excel at, what she really enjoys, what she's not good at and wants to learn more about. So this is sort of a long answer to your question, but it's that enthusiasm for learning. It's willingness to take risks, the willingness to fail and maybe try something hard, because our faculty here will push you, but it's the students who get back up, not those who've just never really been challenged. And so we're looking sort of for that intellectual insight, but really it's about enthusiasm for learning, sort of creative and proactive problem solving, how the students might work in teams. So again, being smart, nothing wrong with being smart, but what do you do with that intellect? How do you push yourself creatively in terms of your enthusiasm for learning? And you can see that in essays, you can see that in recommendations, you can see that in activities, not so much what they did, but what has sort of been the sustained commitment to any 2 or 3 things over time, which could be supporting a family, working 20 hours a week. It doesn't mean joining 20 clubs and starting number 21, because our first question will be, what has been your commitment to anything? So it really is sort of that, again, enthusiasm for learning, commitment to problem solving is sort of how I would narrow it down.
Great. Let's talk about personal qualities, PQs. You're reading a file, once again, essays, recommendations, what you learn about somebody from their activity descriptions, anything else that's in there. What are some personal qualities that make you jump out when you read a file and think, this is somebody who could maybe add something to our community?
Yeah, and Mark, I should have mentioned this before, but I'd say about 10 years ago now, we did a survey for the dean of students and her staff and our faculty across all divisions and said, you know what? We know you want to admit the best and brightest students, but truly, we want to ask you what makes a successful SWATee, and we call Swarthmore students SWATees. And so we got answers back across all 3 divisions, the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And we looked, and there was commonality in terms of those characteristics. And so we've actually put those on our website. So if you go to Swarthmore Admissions and click on the button, it's on the first page, how to apply. It doesn't tell you, first, hey, we need a transcript, we're test optional, you need teacher recs. It says what we look for. And so it actually lists the characteristics, some of which I'm sharing with you. So we care about generosity to others, willingness to work hard, the willingness to seek help when you need that. Often students have worked independently or alone in high school, and if they're homeschooled, that's fine, or maybe that's just been the reality of their situation. So we try to understand the context around that, but really building community and being in a community of difference where not everyone might think like you, or for the first time, you may be surrounded by intellectual peers. And so high school was easy, but Swarthmore is going to be difficult. So how do you rebound to setbacks? So it's generosity towards others, willingness to seek help, and to work hard are the 3 that I would lift up. But on our website, we've lifted those 8 qualities that we seek, both intellectually and socially.
I'm really glad you said that about your website, not only so that anyone interested can go there, but just in general. I hope our listeners heard that. Like, not every college does that, but Swarthmore is not the only one that just has real jewels and gems and insights into what they value. And, I say this thing to students I work with. I said, less than 1% of students I work with spend enough time on the college's website, in my opinion. So I always like to have a shout out for the college's website, especially the admissions section. Is that in your admissions section, Jim, or is that just in the general section? On where again exactly would they find that?
So, okay, go to swarthmoreadmissions.edu, and you're going to see a page with a lot of people sitting in the outdoor amphitheater, and the first button is how to apply. When you click on that first, there it is, what we look for in a SWATee. And then then the second one is how you evaluate your application. So I've heard some high school councils will use this in their junior parent nights as an example of a college that says, hey, they're putting it right on the page. So this may or may not resonate with you, but if it does, they're telling you these are the characteristics. Now, that's different than the needs we have in terms of sports teams and players and things of nature, but in terms of qualities of what makes someone successful. And again, the admissions office didn't make this up. This came from our faculty and from our Dean of Students division.
Well, let's talk about something else you just said that will be of interest to people. How do you evaluate an application?
Yes, we do something, I wouldn't say a little bit different, but we were one of the first to do it. But I give full credit because the idea came out of the University of Pennsylvania's admissions office, and it's called committee-based evaluation, where we sit down in teams of 2 and review all applications. And then if those 2 don't determine admission, but they determine essentially, is this someone competitive to continue on or not? And so essentially you have a driver, someone who's the regional rep that's responsible for the Texas apps or the New York apps or the Georgia apps. And then there were the passenger, who's another dean, who also has their own territory. And what's really nice about it is that you're admitting the best class as opposed to just students from your territory. So every day you're reading with someone else. Some days you're driving, some days you're passengering. And the driver, the person who's in charge of the region, will read the transcript, will read the school profile if there is one, will read the teacher recommendations. What is the rigor that the student is engaging with? Is it an advanced placement program? Is it international baccalaureate? Is it just honors or dual enrollment because there is no AP or honors or IB program? And so we're not looking for one versus the other. We're saying, where are you and how are you taking advantage of the resources that you have? The passenger on the other side is reading the first part of the application. Is the student first generation? Did parents attend college? Where did they go? What are the activities? What are the essays saying? And guess what? We have a conversation. So admissions office may be introverts. I'm an introvert, but we're all extroverted in terms of admissions. We love talking about college, and particularly our own colleges, but just college in general. So on the road, we're promoting college, but then historically, we all hibernate and go read these applications in isolation. And so Penn really blew up that model and said, well, what if we broke up into teams and actually had continued that conversation and said, what strengths are we seeing? What qualities are in the activities, in the background, in the essays, coupled with what I'm reading as a driver in the teacher recommendations, the curriculum, the grades? Is there an upward trend or a downward trend? Did a student change schools? And so if they change schools, which I can see, then they say, oh, I see some break off in activities, but it's because they moved. And that may be in the additional section. And so we're sort of painting a picture of the student, putting all the pieces back together. And so having that conversation really helps, I think, us build the best class. And so as applications have increased, we can't just keep adding staff or FTEs, full-time equivalents. And so breaking it up into teams. Also, we do have some seasonal readers that we train. None of them are drivers. They are just passengers. But really assessing each application in the context of the whole, we think makes a lot of sense and works really well for Swarthmore.
So I believe CBE's been around 15 years. I don't think it's been 20 years. I mean, it's so hard these days.
10,
Would you say 10 years? Is it 10? Okay, it's even less.
15, 16.
Yeah. So what would you say is the difference? Because you've been at, SWAT well before CBE came into effect and after. How would you pinpoint the differences, the gist of the takeaways from the reading experience or the evaluation experience?
Sure. And I think there is no perfect process. And I would argue it's not a fair process. We try to be equitable as possible, meaning we're looking for what Swarthmore needs. Penn may be looking for what they need. Haverford has different needs. And the reason I mention that is I think there's a lot of discussion of fairness. Should the process be fair? Well, is it fair that a regional dean is charged for 1,200 applications in a 6-week period, right? So we often talk about the workload and how do you get through each application. What I really appreciate about at CBE is that we read during the week and during work hours. We don't read on weekends. I don't have a day of work and emails and then have to go home and read 60 applications and stay awake, right? So just in terms of the experience of the professor going through that and the
better work-life balance,
that we put into it. And so there is no perfect process, right? But in terms of camaraderie among peers, and again, admitting the best class as opposed to being so pigeonholed on my territory and my students, you can still be an advocate, but you get a sense of the whole picture. One day you're reading Texas, one day you're reading China, one day you're reading South Africa, one day you're reading Atlanta, Georgia. That's really eye-opening, and I think helps the profession in terms of allowing deans. So we read Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Wednesdays are staff meeting days. We take a day off of reading. And so we fill in the calendar to make sure, because the calendar doesn't grow, But if we are up or down in applications, they still need to be read, and they need to be read efficiently, but also with quality and making informed decisions. And then you can also calibrate. So I think it really helps bond the office. It helps, I will be honest, keep people in the profession who are really good at being on the road and talking about college, but then get overwhelmed by the reading load. And in this model, you can both be a reader and a recruiter and really involved in whatever you do, whether that's working with tour guides or alumni or communications. And so I think it's a really good skill set that we build in terms of that communication among one another, and being able to tell students, we gave you a good look. I won't say a fair shake, right? Because nothing's fair.
Sure.
Just in terms of, I really believe in the model, and it's worked really well and has helped keep people in the profession.
So what would you say to someone who says, wait a minute, this isn't making sense to me? Before you're reading by yourself, now you've got two people in there reading. How is two people reading, not one person reading, reducing your hours and leading to more healthy work-life balance?
Because you can go twice as fast, almost, not quite. But when you're divvying up the work and having the conversation, and also when you are familiar with the school group. So again, this is going to vary by institution, and we're small,
Sure.
but some of our big peers might have 100 and 150 from one high school, right? So you might spend several days on one school reading. Well, you don't have to relearn the transcript every time, right? Or you can sort of know what you're looking for. So it's not new each time. And having those conversations is good, and you can move pretty quickly. And again, we're not looking to make a decision. We're determining, is this student still competitive or not in the pool? And they may go through other rounds or other committees, but we can assess that pretty quickly with a conversation, and you're not making that decision in isolation or agonizing over it or taking 15, 20 minutes to read it, that you move pretty quickly. So we actually, you can go through almost twice as many files with two people as you could with one, and that helps with the calendar. And you start early. You just read through the whole cycle.
Talk a little bit about reading by school group, Jim. How does reading by school group help, in your opinion, to make sort of more accurate decisions on reading?
Yeah, I wouldn't say accurate. I think that's more speed. Not every file is complete, but when you're reading
Mhm.
a school group, again, oh, okay, we just read the student. We know that they have an AP curriculum, or they have a combined AP IB curriculum. Wow, we see that they offer 20 AP courses, but this school specifically says you can take no more than 2 a semester, right? And
Mhm.
so you may see, an average AP load might be 3, 4, 5, 6 APs, even though 20 are listed on the transcript. So again, understanding how that system works, because, if you're reading one file where they took umpteen APs, or another one, which is an international baccalaureate student, you get a sense of, okay, we know what the curriculum is here. We can move a little bit more quickly when we get to the transcript piece. This is what these mean in context. And here's the other thing, which may sound a little counterintuitive, and I'm speaking here strictly of highly selective schools. The students who apply, probably many of them have the grades and scores if they submit tests to get in. The question is, do they have these characteristics we're looking for, or the needs of the institution? So, Mark, my grades might be, half a point higher than yours, or a quarter of a point. I've got a 4.5 GPA and you've got a 4.45. We're essentially even, but mine's higher. My scores may be a little bit higher than yours, but guess what? You play the trumpet and I play the flute, and they need trumpet players this year. We're both qualified. Again, and here's the fair part, but we need trumpet players from Austin who meet whatever need. So a lot of students are admissible, but do they fit the needs of the institution or the characteristics we see? One student may not play well with others, and we're seeing that consistently in recommendations, the way they write their essays, versus the other student who, has generosity towards others, has showed sustained commitment, hasn't just joined every club under the sun, but can't tell us why they do any of it. And there's also an analysis piece. We want to see a little bit of analysis in the essays, and oftentimes they are very descriptive. And so you can look equal on paper in terms of your grades and scores, but look very different on the written page. And having that conversation among two people helps move that a little bit more quickly. And also in school groups, you get a sense of, what are the needs of our institution? What kind of students do they have? And so that's a real luxury at a selective institution, is to be able to pick and choose among the best and brightest from all schools. But, and here's the good news, potentially, you could take multiple students from that school or none. So it's not about the number that apply, it's about the number who apply, who meet that minimum requirement, but then also add the value that we're seeking through characteristics, either intellectual or social. I hope that makes sense.
No, it's great. It's great. This is awesome stuff. Good stuff. Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Jim Bach, Vice President and Dean of Admission at Swarthmore College. We hope you'll join us next week for the next part. On Monday's episode, I'm going to share with you 2 conversations with admission leaders at the SACAC conference I had. One, I can share the name of the college, and one I can't, but I think you're going to find both of them interesting. One has to do with the anti-DEI zeal of the new administration, and one has to do with the role of early decision. Then we will hear part 2 of 4 of Lisa's interview with Jenny Winthrop and Rebecca Anderson, authors of the book, The Disengaged Teen. And remember, we have 2 events on April 13th. Just go to the yourcollegeboundkid.com website, go to the event page, because we have a number of events for the rest of April. And I will be coming to you from Dallas, Texas, and I will have already spent 2 days in Shreveport, Louisiana at that time. Friends, May 1st is around the corner. We call that National Candidate Reply Day. We also call it Decision Day. And as your student makes their college decision, please remember this. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go. But it's what you do when you get there. It's what you do when you get out of there. That is what will determine your career success. See you on Monday, friends, from Dallas, Texas. I'll be at SMU. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.